November 2024. A Sunday morning like any other at the Potter's house in Dallas, Texas. Thousands of people in the pews. Cameras rolling for the live stream, like they always do. And in the pulpit, a 67-year-old man who has spent nearly 5 decades doing exactly one thing, preaching. Then, mid-sermon, he stumbles. He grabs the podium. His words start to slur, and in front of his entire congregation, and in front of a live stream audience of thousands more watching from home, Bishop T.D. Jakes has a massive heart attack, live, on stage. Doctors would later tell him something that should stop anyone in their tracks. If he had arrived at the hospital 5 minutes later, he would not have survived. 5 minutes. That single number changed everything that came next. Not just for T.D. Jakes the man, but for one of the largest, most influential churches in America. Because what happened in the months after that heart attack was not just a health recovery story. It was the quiet unraveling of a succession plan that had been building for years, forced out into the open faster than anyone expected, including, by his own admission, Jakes himself. Stick with me, because this story has everything. A near-death moment caught on camera, a family secret that wasn't really a secret at all, tears in front of 30,000 members, and a decision that's going to reshape one of the most powerful pulpits in the country for the next generation. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Bishop Jakes stood in front of his church and said the words that shocked absolutely nobody who was paying close attention and devastated everybody who wasn't. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to understand what T.D. Jakes actually built. This wasn't some small-town pastor who got lucky with a viral sermon. Thomas Dexter Jakes started preaching in the 1970s, and by the 1990s, he had become one of the most recognizable faith leaders on the planet. In 1996, he planted the Potter's House in South Dallas, and what began in a modest storefront exploded into a movement. Today, it's a congregation of more than 30,000 members, with campuses spread across Dallas, Fort Worth, North Dallas, and even Denver. It's consistently ranked among the largest and most influential churches in the entire country. But Jakes was never just a local pastor. He became a global brand, best-selling author, movie producer, a man whose sermons filled arenas, whose conferences packed convention centers, whose voice carried weight not just in churches but in boardrooms and in politics. For a long stretch of American religious history, if you said the words megachurch pastor, there was a very good chance the first face that came to mind was his. And through all of that, the books, the films, the conferences, the fame, there was one constant. Every single Sunday, for 29 years, he stood in that pulpit at the Potter's house. He built a ministry that became, in the words of people who study Black church history, a genuine paradigm shift. Before Jakes, there were budding megachurches. After Jakes, there was a model that an entire generation of ministries tried to replicate. People didn't just want to hear him preach. They wanted to build something like what he built, which is exactly why the question of what happens when he's gone was never really a small question. It was a question about the future of Black church leadership in America. And it's a question Jakes had clearly been wrestling with, quietly, carefully, for years, long before that November morning forced it into the light. Let's go back to that Sunday in November 2024, because the details matter. Jakes was mid-sermon. This is a man who has preached thousands of sermons over his career. This was routine for him in every sense except one. Cameras were rolling, because they always roll. The Potter's House live streams its services to a massive online audience, which means what happened next didn't just happen in front of a room of people. It happened in front of the world. He began to slur his words. He gripped the podium. And then he collapsed. A massive heart attack, unfolding in real time, broadcast live, with no warning and no script. What followed was, by all accounts, terrifying for everyone in that building. But it was also, in a strange way, a moment that revealed exactly how prepared, and how unprepared, an institution like the Potter's House was for a crisis like this. Jakes survived. He got to the hospital in time. And later, in an interview with NBC's Today Show, he shared just how close it actually was. Doctors told him that if he had arrived 5 minutes later, he wouldn't have made it. Think about that for a second. 5 minutes. Not 5 hours. Not 5 days. 5 minutes stood between one of the most influential religious leaders in America and a very different story than the one we're telling right now. For most people, surviving something like that would be reason enough to slow down, to rest, to let the moment pass and get back to business as usual once the danger cleared. But for Jakes, it seems to have done the opposite. It seems to have clarified something he had already been circling for years but hadn't yet been forced to fully confront. Here's the part of this story that a lot of people got wrong when the announcement first broke. The instinct, understandably, was to assume that the heart attack caused the succession, that Jakes had a health scare, panicked, and suddenly decided to hand over the keys. That's not actually what happened, and it's worth slowing down on this, because the real story is more interesting than the assumption. According to a spokesperson for the Potter's House, the plan for Sarah Jakes Roberts to eventually take over leadership had been in the works for years. Not months, years. This wasn't improvised. It was a long, deliberate, carefully paced strategy that had been quietly unfolding in the background of the ministry for a long time before the public ever heard the word succession. Consider the timeline. Back in 2022, Jakes had already handed his daughter something enormously symbolic, the reins of his signature women's conference, Woman, Thou Art Loosed, which Sarah relaunched and rebranded as Woman Evolve. That wasn't a small gesture. That conference was one of the crown jewels of his ministry, a platform he had built and nurtured for decades. Passing it to her was, in hindsight, an early signal of where things were headed. Then, in 2023, Sarah Jakes Roberts and her husband, Toure Roberts, were formally installed as assistant pastors of the Potter's House. And here's a detail that matters: the family had actually relocated. Toure Roberts had built and led his own respected ministry in Los Angeles, one that eventually became part of the Potter's House network. The couple made the decision to move from LA to Dallas specifically to become more active in what the family later described as the evolution of this growing ministry. That's not language you use for a casual visit. That's language you use when you're relocating your entire life to prepare for something much bigger. So by the time November 2024 happened, the pieces were already largely in place. The air wasn't a mystery. The transition wasn't a blank page. What the heart attack did was something different, and in some ways more human. It added urgency to a plan that had been unfolding on a slow, careful, multi-year timeline. Jakes himself put it in the starkest terms possible when he finally stood before his congregation to make the announcement official. He said he could not afford, especially after what happened in November, to risk something happening to him and leaving his people, in his words, as sheep without a shepherd. That's the phrase that stuck with a lot of people who were in that room. Sheep without a shepherd. It's a biblical image, and Jakes knew exactly what he was invoking: the fear, deeply rooted in Scripture and in the culture of the Black church, of a congregation left rudderless, without covering, without direction. He wasn't just talking about administrative succession. He was talking about spiritual protection for tens of thousands of people who had built their lives, in some cases around his voice, from that pulpit. So let's get to the actual announcement, because the way it happened tells you just as much as what was announced. It came on a Sunday morning service at the Potter's House, roughly 6 months after the heart attack. Jakes stood before his congregation, his wife, Sarita Jakes, by his side, and began to speak. And by every account from people who were in that room, this was not a cold, corporate handoff. This was raw. He thanked his congregation directly. "You have been faithful to God, and you have been faithful to me," he told them. "And I'm so grateful." He was, according to multiple reports, visibly holding back tears as he said it. And then he said the words that made headlines around the country: he was stepping down as senior pastor. The role would be transferred to his daughter, Sarah Jakes Roberts, and her husband, Toure Roberts. They would begin their new positions as co-senior pastors starting that July. Now here's something that's easy to miss if you only skim the headlines. Jakes wasn't disappearing. He made that explicitly clear. He would remain on the Potter's House Board of Directors, staying on as chairman and as what's been described as the church's spiritual overseer. This was being framed, very deliberately, not as an ending, but as what the Jakes family called purposeful evolution. In fact, the family released a letter to the congregation right after the announcement that used exactly that phrase. They wrote that they had shared with the world their long-held plans for what they called purposeful evolution for the Potter's House and the church's global family. They talked about how preparing for the announcement over the past several years had allowed them, as a family and as a global church community, to carefully balance the needs of their community worldwide with the pace at which each step of the plan was carried out. That's remarkably candid language for a church press release. It's basically confirming, in writing, exactly what the spokesperson had already said. This was years in the making, and the family had been walking through it deliberately, one careful step at a time. And then, in the moment that really landed with the people watching, Sarah Jakes Roberts responded. Fighting through tears, she embraced her father in front of the congregation and said something that captured the emotional weight of the whole moment, that as pastor-elect and as his daughter, she was grateful and she was honored. Watch footage of that moment and it doesn't look like a business transaction. It looks like a family, in public, processing something enormous, grief over a near-death experience, gratitude for survival, pride in a legacy, and the weight of an entire congregation watching to see how they'd handle it. Here's something a lot of coverage of big institutional stories misses: the people in the pews. Because this wasn't just a headline for the 30,000 members of the Potter's House. This was personal. Longtime members spoke to local reporters in the days after the announcement, and their reactions were layered. There was real sadness. One member, Patrick Moore, put it about as honestly as you can. He said it's hard to replace an icon like Bishop Jakes, and that honestly, it's actually impossible to do. Very sad, he said. That reaction makes sense. When you've built decades of your spiritual life around one voice, one presence, one person standing in that specific pulpit every Sunday, the idea of that changing, even when you understand why, even when you respect the reasoning, still feels like a loss. Grief doesn't care how well planned a transition is. But alongside that sadness, there was something else in the room, too. Hope. Despite the sense of loss, many members expressed genuine optimism that this change could carry the Potter's House into a new era, one built for a different generation of believers. And that tension, grief, and hope, sitting right next to each other, is probably the most honest way to describe what that congregation went through in 2025. It's rarely one or the other. It's almost always both. Now, if you've never heard the name Sarah Jakes Roberts before this story, it's worth understanding exactly who is stepping into this role. Because she's not simply the pastor's daughter. She has spent years building her own identity, her own audience, and her own platform, separate from her father's shadow. She's a best-selling author in her own right. Her Woman Evolve movement, which grew out of the conference her father handed her back in 2022, has become a massive platform in its own right, built specifically around inspiring women to step into their potential, often drawing on her own very public and very honest testimony about hardship, faith, and personal reinvention. That's an important detail, because Sarah Jakes Roberts didn't build her public voice by simply repeating her father's message. She built it, in large part, around vulnerability, sharing her own story of becoming a teenage mother, of a difficult first marriage, of rebuilding her life and her faith from a place that was far from perfect. That kind of raw honesty resonated deeply, especially with Black Christian women who saw themselves reflected in her story in a way that felt different from the traditional, polished pulpit image. Her husband, Toure Roberts, brings his own credibility to the role as well. Before relocating to Dallas, he had built and led a respected ministry of his own in Los Angeles, one that ultimately became part of the Potter's House network when the couple made their move. He's not simply the son-in-law. He's a pastor with his own following, his own reputation, and his own leadership experience, walking into this role as a genuine partner rather than a passenger. Together, they represent something the Potter's House very clearly wanted: continuity with the legacy, but also a real generational shift. Two leaders who grew up immersed in ministry culture, but who also came of age in a completely different media landscape, a different cultural moment, and by their own description, a calling to meet that moment on its own terms rather than simply imitating what came before. The April announcement was the reveal, but the actual transfer of power happened months later in a ceremony that made the transition official in front of the entire church. On July 6th, during a celebration marking the Potter's House's 29th anniversary, Sarah Jakes Roberts and Toure Roberts were formally installed as co-senior pastors. This wasn't a quiet formality tucked into a regular Sunday service. It was a nearly 4-hour ceremony, held in a sanctuary that seats more than 8,000 people, and it was packed. Members, guests, dozens of ministers, elders, and deacons all came out for it. The Robertses wore black suits with white clerical collars for the installation. Gospel artist Judith Christie McAllister led worship, and speaker Cindy Trim delivered a tribute to Jakes and his family in a message pointedly titled The Last Sermon, Leadership Redefined, a title that, on its own, tells you exactly how the church wanted this moment remembered. Jakes himself, during the service, reflected on how much the world had changed since he first planted that church nearly 3 decades earlier. He talked about living through September 11th, through Hurricane Katrina, through the COVID-19 pandemic, all the seismic events that had reshaped the country during his tenure, and he expressed real gratitude for how the Potter's House had been able to walk alongside its members through all of it, spiritually and practically. He was honest, too, about uncertainty. He told the congregation he didn't know exactly what the future holds, but he said the same God who had carried the church through 29 years would carry both the congregation and its next generation of leaders through the 29 years still to come. And in a detail that a lot of people found genuinely moving, he pushed back, publicly in that very service, against the idea that what was happening was simply a family member inheriting a position. This is not an inheritance, he told the packed sanctuary. This is a calling. It's a small distinction on paper, but it mattered enormously to how the church wanted this framed. Not nepotism, not a dynasty being handed down like property, but a spiritual assignment being entrusted to people the family and the institution believed were genuinely called to carry it. Near the end of that service, Jakes gave his final charge directly to Sarah and Toure in front of everyone. He told them to serve the congregation, to love them well. And he turned to the members themselves and told them plainly to submit to the couple's leadership and to encourage them as they stepped into this enormous responsibility. Watch that moment, and you understand exactly what was being handed over that day. Not just a title, not just an org chart position, but the trust of 30,000 people, built over 29 years, being transferred in real time. So what happens to a man who spent nearly 50 years standing behind one pulpit once he steps away from it? Based on everything that's come out since the transition, the answer is, he's not slowing down, he's redirecting. Jakes remains chairman of the Potter's House board and its spiritual overseer, meaning his voice and his covering over the institution haven't disappeared. But the bulk of his energy has clearly shifted towards something he had already been quietly building for years: the TD Jakes Group. That organization is focused on economic empowerment work, things like job creation, workforce development for the modern economy, housing equity, and entrepreneurship, particularly in underserved communities. In the months following the transition, his team relaunched the Good Soil Forum in Dallas, bringing together entrepreneurs, funders, and leaders of color to tackle the barriers that keep small businesses from scaling. There's also been a global exchange summit connecting conversations across the African diaspora and new programming partnerships in podcasting to reach audiences far beyond the walls of any single church building. In other words, stepping down from the pulpit didn't mean stepping back from influence. It meant reallocating decades of built-up credibility and relationships toward a different kind of impact. One measured less in Sunday attendance and more in economic outcomes for the communities he spent his career serving. And that reframing matters, because it changes how you should understand this entire story. This wasn't really a retirement. It was a redistribution of labor inside one very large, very ambitious life's work, pastoral leadership handed to the next generation, while the founder redirects his own remaining energy toward the next chapter of his mission. Here's why this isn't just a celebrity pastor story that fades in a week. Succession is one of the hardest, most fragile moments in the life of any large institution, churches very much included. History is full of examples of powerful ministries that didn't survive the transition when a founding leader stepped away, whether from death, scandal, or simple mismanagement of the handoff. Congregations fracture. Splinter churches form. Legacies get tangled in legal and financial disputes. It happens constantly, and it happens to organizations far smaller and far less complex than a 30,000-member multi-campus megachurch with a media empire attached to it. What makes the Potter's House situation genuinely notable is how deliberately it was handled. Not perfectly, not without pain, but deliberately. Years of quiet preparation. Symbolic handoffs long before the official one, like the Women's Conference in 2022. A formal installation as assistant pastors in 2023. A public announcement in 2025 that named the plan, explained the reasoning, and gave the congregation months to process it emotionally before the actual transfer of title happened in July. And even then, the founder didn't vanish. He stayed connected as chairman, redirecting rather than disappearing. Scholars who study Black church history have pointed out that Jakes' ministry represented a genuine paradigm shift when it first rose to prominence, a model that an entire generation of pastors tried to replicate. It's worth asking whether this succession might end up being just as influential a model, proof that a founder-led megachurch can pass its pulpit to a new generation without the institution collapsing under the weight of the transition. And there's a deeply human layer underneath all of that institutional analysis, too. A man had a heart attack in front of his own congregation, was 5 minutes from death, and used that terrifying brush with mortality not to panic, but to accelerate a plan built on years of patient, careful thought. His daughter and son-in-law stepped into an almost impossible task, following a legend in front of a global audience while trying, in their own words, not to become another version of him, but to lead as themselves. That's not just a church story. That's a story about legacy, about family, about what it actually looks like to hand something you built with your whole life to the people you trust most, and to do it in public, with your whole community watching. It's one thing to watch a handoff happen from the outside. It's another to hear how the people actually living it describe the weight of it once the cameras move on to the next story. In an interview months after the installation, Toure Roberts opened up about just how heavy this assignment has felt in private. He described the biggest weight he carried as the weight of responsibility itself, the simple, constant awareness that this cannot go down. Not on his watch, not on Sarah's watch. That phrase, "this cannot go down," says everything about the pressure of stepping into a pulpit this large, this visible, and this scrutinized. But he also pushed back on a trap that's easy to fall into when you're following a legendary figure. The trap of trying to become a copy of the person you're replacing. He was clear that it felt important, spiritually, not to try to become Bishop Jakes. The calling wasn't to imitate a legacy. It was to carry it forward in a form that was authentically their own. He and Sarah also revealed that before they ever accepted this assignment, they made deliberate, non-negotiable commitments to one another as a couple. They agreed they were not going to lose themselves in the role. They were not going to lose their marriage. And they were not going to lose their family. In an environment where public ministry has a well-documented history of quietly destroying private lives, that's not a small promise to make out loud. It's a boundary drawn in advance, before the pressure of the position had a chance to test it. There's something worth sitting with in that. The public story is about a church, a pulpit, a legendary founder, and a dramatic health scare. But underneath all of that is a much smaller, much more human story. Two people who fell in love after both surviving painful divorces, who built a life and a ministry together, and who are now trying to carry an enormous public assignment without losing the private relationship that made them capable of carrying it in the first place. That tension between public calling and private life may end up being the real test of this entire succession, long after the headlines about the heart attack and the installation ceremony have faded. So when people say the church didn't expect this from the Potter's house, that's only half true. They didn't expect the timing. They didn't expect to watch a man they loved nearly die on the very stage where he'd led them for decades. But the plan itself? That had been building quietly for years, one careful step at a time, until a 5-minute margin between life and death turned a long-term vision into an urgent reality. Bishop T.D. Jakes stood in front of 30,000 people and told them the truth, that he could not risk leaving them without a shepherd. And then he showed them exactly what real preparation looks like, by handing them two. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments what stood out to you the most. The heart attack, the family's years of quiet preparation, or that final line about calling versus inheritance. And if you want more deep dives into the stories behind the headlines of America's biggest ministries, make sure you're subscribed, because this is exactly the kind of story we go deep on. Thanks for watching.